When I first arrived in Vietnam, everything felt confused. Not only what was happening around me, but what was happening inside my own head. Nothing lined up the way I expected it to. Sounds, movements, orders, faces, all of it came at once, and there was no clear edge to grab onto. At the beginning, it did not feel real. It felt distant, like I was watching something unfold instead of standing inside it, like a version of war I had only seen on television or heard people talk about back home. That feeling did not last very long. Little by little, without any single moment marking the change, the reality settled in. I began to understand that this was not training and it was not a rehearsal. I was in a real war, surrounded by people who were armed, watching and waiting. And there was someone out there whose entire purpose at that moment was to kill me. Once that thought takes hold, there is no pushing it away. It stays with you, no matter how much you try to ignore it. At that point, everything narrows. You stop thinking in wide terms about missions or strategy or politics. You start thinking in simple, direct terms. You either learn how to function in that environment or you do not survive it. There is no middle ground. I realized that if someone was going to shoot at me, then my job was to find him first, see him clearly, and fire back. I was not going to die out there because I froze or hesitated. It came down to his life or mine. And once you accept that, the world looks very different. It took me a few months to fully adjust to that reality. Those early months were the hardest because every sound made you tense, every movement made you wonder if this was the moment everything ended. Training helps, but training at home does not recreate the feeling of knowing that a single mistake can get you killed. Out there, you learn quickly that fear never completely goes away. What changes is how you carry it and how you act in spite of it. There is nothing heroic about that process. There are no speeches, no clear lines between good moments and bad ones. You simply learn to function. You learn to watch more carefully, to listen more closely, and to react faster than the person trying to kill you. You learn to trust the men around you because your life depends on them and their lives depend on you. That was the moment when war stopped being an idea and became something physical and immediate. It was no longer something happening somewhere else. It was happening right where I stood. And from that point forward, every step, every decision, and every second mattered. I was born in San Jose, California, and I grew up in a family where military service was not something distant or abstract. My father had been in the Army, and my uncles had served as well, some of them during the Second World War and one during the Korean War. That history existed around me, but it was not the reason I joined. I did not grow up dreaming about being a soldier or talking about medals or battles. My life at that time was much simpler than that. We worked in the fields. Farming was what we did day after day, season after season. It was hard work, physical work, and it felt endless. By the time I was 17 years old, I knew I did not want that life to be my future. I was young, restless, and certain that if I stayed where I was, nothing would ever change. I wanted out, even if I did not fully understand what I was getting into. I remember telling my father that I wanted to join the Army. He looked at me and asked if I understood that there was a war going on. I told him that I did. There was no long speech between us and no dramatic moment. He knew it was what I wanted, and in the end, he signed the paperwork. My mother cried. She did not want me to go, and I cannot blame her for that. I was still a kid in many ways, even if I thought of myself as grown. Once the decision was made, everything moved quickly. I went into the military and was sent to basic training at Fort Lewis in Washington. That period is still clear in my memory, partly because there was a meningitis outbreak at the time. Because of that, our training was handled differently. We were separated by barracks and trained as units rather than individually. It added another layer of tension to an environment that was already demanding. Basic training stripped away whatever illusions I might have had. It was strict, exhausting, and relentless. You learn to follow orders, to function as part of a group, and to push through discomfort without complaining. At the same time, it was still controlled. No matter how hard it felt, you knew deep down that it was not combat, you were not being shot at, and nobody was trying to kill you. Looking back, that gap between training and reality stands out more than anything else. At the time, I believed I was preparing myself for what was coming. I did not yet understand how little preparation could truly do once I found myself in a real war. After basic training, I was assigned to become a combat engineer, and that changed everything about the kind of work I was going to do in Vietnam. I was sent to Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri for specialized training, where I learned to work with explosives and to deal with situations most people never think about until they are standing in the middle of them. My job was not only about building things like roads or bridges, although that was part of what combat engineers did. My main responsibility was explosives. I was trained as an explosive specialist. That meant carrying C4, locating mines, dealing with unexploded ordnance, and destroying anything that posed a danger to our units. Bombs dropped from aircraft that did not go off, booby traps left behind, mines hidden along trails or roads, all of that fell under our responsibility. It was not like the movies, where someone carefully cuts wires and disarms a device with seconds left on a clock. Most of the time, we placed explosives and destroyed the threat right where it was. The goal was not to be dramatic. The goal was to make sure nobody else got hurt. I was attached to infantry units, which meant I was right there with them, moving through the same terrain and facing the same risks. Along with explosives, I carried standard weapons, including an M16 rifle and a .45 caliber pistol. Everything you carried had a purpose, and everything added weight. You learned quickly what you needed and what you could live without. My first real engagement with the enemy happened not long after I arrived. It must have been within my first month in country. We were operating out of Bearcat, and we went out on a night patrol beyond the berm. We were hit by a small Viet Cong unit. I was completely green, my fatigues were still new, still bright, and I had never been under real fire before. When it happened, shock took over. The first thing I did was hit the ground. I did not know where the fire was coming from or where to aim. All the training you go through back home does not fully prepare you for that moment. When the rounds start coming in, everything you learned feels distant, like it belongs to someone else. You hear the bullets pass by your head, making a sharp sound, almost like a bee buzzing past you, and all you can think about is staying alive. That first firefight did not last long. We called in artillery support, and within a couple of minutes it was over. But the impact of it stayed with me. That was when I truly understood that I was in a war, and that nothing about it was controlled or predictable. From that point on, everything I did carried a different weight. After those first contacts, the pattern of daily operations became clear very quickly. Almost every time we went out, we were engaged in some way. It was rarely a large unit. Most of the time it was 10 or 15 men, small Viet Cong elements, whose purpose was not to hold ground but to disrupt, harass, and disappear. They would fire at us and then fire again from another position and vanish back into the jungle. It happened so often that you stopped being surprised by it. That constant pressure forced you to change. Fear was always there, but it stopped being the center of everything. You learned that if you stayed frozen, you would not last long. Slowly, without anyone explaining it to you, your thinking shifted. Instead of waiting for something to happen, you started anticipating it. You watched the terrain differently. You listened more carefully. You paid attention to small details that would not matter anywhere else. Fighting in the jungle was nothing like fighting in open ground. The jungle was alive and dense, always green, always closing in around you. The Viet Cong understood that environment perfectly. They wore dark clothing, and against all that green, those dark shapes were the only thing that stood out if you trained your eyes to look for them. You learned to focus, to notice movement instead of shape, to catch the slight shift of black against green that meant someone was there. They were good at moving. They would fire from one place, then relocate and fire again from somewhere else. If you were not paying attention, you could spend all your time shooting at empty space. After a while, you learned to track where the movement was going, not just where it had been. When you saw it clearly enough, you fired. And most of the time, that took care of the problem. At the same time, something else was happening. You stopped thinking only about yourself. You became protective of the men around you because they were doing the same for you. Everyone depended on everyone else. There was no room for ego or individual glory. If one man failed, someone else paid the price. That understanding bound us together in a way that is hard to explain to anyone who has not lived inside it. Over time, the chaos of those early days settled into something almost routine. Not safe, never safe, but familiar. You accepted that this was how things were. You learned how to function inside that reality, how to keep moving, how to fight, and how to survive in a place that was always trying to kill you. The day that stays with me more than any other was December 4th, 1967. We were operating in Long Province during Operation Cobra. At that time, we were working off a Navy landing ship tank, moving through the Mekong Delta as part of a riverine force. We disembarked from the ship and began moving inland, marching for about a mile through jungle terrain before reaching an open area of rice paddies. The jungle was on our left, the sun was in front of us, and the ground ahead looked deceptively calm. Without warning, we were hit. It was a classic U-shaped ambush, and it was set up perfectly. The machine gun position was placed directly in the center, and as soon as the firing started, we were cut down where we stood. We had been walking upright, exposed, and the first burst tore through the formation. There was no clear direction to move. We could not push forward. We could not move to either side, and trying to retreat under that kind of fire felt impossible. Everyone hit the ground and dropped into the rice paddies. The problem was that there was almost no cover. The paddies were filled with water, broken only by small raised mounds that were not high enough to protect you. Bullets were ripping through the area, and men were being hit all around me. You could feel the rounds striking the earth and water, hear them snapping past, and know that staying still did not guarantee anything. Our point man, a good friend of ours named Washington, went down hard. The intensity of the fire broke him in that moment. He froze, overwhelmed by the noise and the chaos, stuck out in the open while the rest of us were pinned down. It was clear that if he stayed there, he was not going to make it. Another soldier and I crawled out under fire to reach him. We dragged him back toward the small mound where we had taken what little cover there was. Somehow, we made it back without being hit, though rounds were tearing past us the entire time. The situation kept getting worse. Our radio operator, Don, was killed, and our lieutenant, a red-haired officer from Louisiana we all called Frenchie, became separated from the radio. We needed air support, and Without communication, we were finished. Someone managed to get the radio to him, and he began calling for help while the rest of us tried to stay alive under the machine gun fire that was still cutting through the paddies. At that point, everything narrowed again. There was no room for fear or hesitation. There was only the problem in front of us and the understanding that if it was not dealt with, none of us were getting out of there. I moved when I probably should not have, but something inside me decided that staying where I was meant dying anyway. Every time I shifted even slightly, more fire came in, but I knew the machine gun was the key to everything. As long as it was operating, we were pinned down and bleeding out. Frenchie asked me if I could move to the side and see what I could do, and I did not stop to think about it for very long. I got up and ran. I fired as I moved, aiming toward the section where I had seen movement. The distance was not far, maybe 25 or 40 meters, but it felt endless. I hit one of the men in that position and kept going. There was another figure near him, and I took him down as well. At some point in those seconds, I ran out of ammunition. I remember realizing it and thinking that this was how it ended. Instead of freezing, I grabbed one of the rifles dropped by the Viet Cong. A rifle is a rifle when you need it, and there was ammunition nearby. I used that weapon to keep moving forward and finally engaged the machine gun position directly. When you see a head above a gun, you aim for the head. One shot ended it. The firing that had been cutting us apart stopped almost immediately after that. Another man in a nearby position tried to run and was killed by the fire coming from our side. I continued firing into a foxhole where I believed there were more enemy fighters. I cannot say with certainty which shots did what in those moments. Everything was noise, movement, and instinct. What I know is that after that, the intensity of the ambush broke. 2 more enemy soldiers jumped up and ran, and then it was over. When it ended, only 7 of us were still able to fight out of the original 25 who had moved out that morning. The rest were dead or wounded. We regrouped and continued the mission because that was what we were there to do. Later, a 2-star general flew in by helicopter to assess what had happened. I was a specialist, 4th class at the time, and right there in the field, I was promoted to sergeant. Months later, I was told that I would be receiving the Bronze Star. It came as a surprise. I did not feel like I had done anything special. Things like that just happen in combat. People ask how you find the strength or courage to do something like that, and I never have a good answer. Sometimes the situation demands something from you, and you either respond or you do not. That ambush was not the end of the war for me. It was only one point in a long stretch of time where danger never really backed off. Over the course of my tour, I was wounded 3 times, and each time it happened differently, in a different place, under different circumstances, but always with the same understanding that it could have ended right there. The first serious wound came in late January or early February around the time of the Tet Offensive. We were operating in the jungle in northern Vietnam, near Hue City. We had been moving through dense terrain when we were ambushed again. As we pulled back to reposition, a Viet Cong fighter came up out of the brush so close that there was no time to think. He bayoneted me on my right side, puncturing my lung, and then pulled back. I remember the shock more than the pain at first. My partner, a man I worked with constantly and trusted completely, reacted immediately and shot him before he could finish what he started. That injury sent me through Saigon and then to Osaka in Japan for treatment. The doctors repaired the lung, reinflated it, and sealed it. I remember being told not to breathe too deeply for a short time so it would not reopen. Even lying there, patched up and recovering, the war did not feel far away. It felt paused, like something waiting for me to step back into it. Later, in September of 1968, I was bayoneted again, this time in Longin Province near an old French fort. We were moving through a trail when an enemy soldier jumped out and drove the bayonet into my left side so hard that it lodged between my ribs. For a moment, neither of us could move without making it worse. My partner again stepped in, braced himself, and forced the man off me so we could end it. That wound became infected, but after a few weeks, I was back out there. That was how it worked. You healed enough to move, and then you went back. The last time I was wounded was by a sniper while we were moving through rice paddies. The round went through my arm, in one side and out the other. Compared to the other wounds, it felt minor. No stitches, no long recovery. By then, you learned to take things in stride, not because they did not matter, but because stopping to dwell on them was not an option. Living that close to death changes how you look at everything. It hardens you, but it also strips things down to what matters. You stop thinking about how things should be and focus only on how they are. I left Vietnam in late 1968, just before Christmas. When I came home, the war did not end the way I had imagined it might. There were protests going on back in the United States, and many soldiers were treated badly when they returned. I was aware of it, but I stayed away from it as much as I could. I went back to California and spent 30 days at home on leave. San Jose was not like some of the larger college cities, and I managed to keep my distance from most of the demonstrations. I was not interested in arguments or explanations. I was just trying to exist again in a place that felt unfamiliar in its own way. After my leave ended, I went back to Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, this time not as a trainee but as an instructor. I trained others in explosives, teaching them what I knew about a job that was dangerous even before you added combat to it. Later, I was transferred to Fort Campbell in Kentucky, where the Green Beret units were based. I worked with the 168th Special Forces support structure and spent more time training and preparing others for the kind of work I had already done. Eventually, my time in the Army came to an end, and I left the military behind. There was no ceremony that closed the chapter, no clean break between who I had been in the war and who I was supposed to be afterward. The experiences stayed with me, the sounds, the movements, the memories of men who did not make it back all remained long after the shooting stopped. War does not disappear when you leave it. It settles into you quietly and becomes part of how you see the world. You learn to live with it, not by celebrating it or denying it, but by carrying it forward in silence. That is how it ended for me. Not with victory or defeat, but with distance, memory, and the understanding that some parts of that life never really let go.